Hey Next Economy Now listeners, we're excited to announce that registration for our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA is officially open. Beginning March 25th, 2025, this 9-month facilitated learning journey was created for listeners like you, the entrepreneurs, artists, community leaders, and other folks on the front lines of the next economy. Based on our 15 years of experience working with over 300 different social enterprises, we'll explore the pitfalls of the business-as-usual economy and dive into key business principles from a regenerative and just perspective, all while fostering the community and connection we need to stay resilient, inspired, and motivated in our movement for global change. Interested in learning more? Join us for a free intro session where you can meet course facilitators and hear from our amazing alumni to determine if the course is a fit for you. Plus, you can save 20% on tuition when you register before February 3rd during our early bird sale. Get started at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Thanks for listening, and now onto the show.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, my name is Aaron Axelrod, and I am a partner worker owner at Lift Economy. I'm so pleased you're doing this conversation today with Aaron Goggans, WildSeed Society. So Aaron is a writer, a facilitator, organizer, and architect of the future. Aaron builds movement infrastructure before people know they need it and helps them achieve things even he never imagined were possible. Aaron is a co-creator of Black Lives Matter DC, WildSeed Society, and a handful of other projects that have made liberatory marks on the world. And we were joking at the top of this conversation that the most accurate description of Aaron was written by Breitbart. They once said Aaron Goggans wants to fundamentally transform American society and wants to use the Black community to do it. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Aaron Goggans. And I'm also joined by Jeanette Moreland as well, the marketing lead at Lift Economy.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And thanks, Jeanette, as well.
Yeah.
So excited you're on the call, too. So Aaron, Jeanette, and I would love for you to introduce yourself in any way that feels like it is resonating right now.
Yeah. As somebody who talks about themselves a lot, it's always hard for me to explain what it is and what I do, which is why I find that Breitbart article just so fascinating. It came at a time when a lot of organizers in the movement for Black Lives were being interviewed, and they just didn't. I think there was a lot of sympathetic liberals who tried to explain what we were trying to do in ways that were palatable. And Breitbart was no, they want to burn everything down and create something new. And I was but basically, yeah, to understand my work, you have to understand a kind of somebody who's on the spectrum and really likes rules and thinks that rules should make sense and be followed. But when rules don't make sense and don't lead to justice or equity, just somatically can't stand rules that don't work for the majority of people or the people they're supposed to work for. And I think for a lot of reasons, views the basic agreements that form the basis of life in the U.S. to be untenable and outdated, and has spent the last couple of years, at this point, almost 2 decades, trying to understand and figure out ways to rewrite them and create new agreements, better agreements. And whether that's facilitating space and coming up with community agreements, or agreements between organizations and coalition building, or in sort of the current iteration, thinking about the kind of fundamental stories and agreements that allow us to reproduce our life, whether it's agreements with our job, agreements with our family, agreements with our sort of kinships, structures, and how capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy organize those agreements to fit into one coherent system. And that so much time has shaped how each of those relationships and each of those parts of our lives think about making agreements, the containers of those agreements, the ends, like what we can get out of those relationships, what, to use the term, like relational goods our agreements can produce, is all shaped by those kind of fundamental things that it can be really hard to build the next system. And so I think what I spend my time doing with WildSeed is trying to build a community where we kind of experiment in ways to build a life based on a more liberatory set of central agreements, a life where everybody can get their needs met with joy and dignity, and then experiment with what kind of actual social infrastructure do we need to do that at a higher scale, to do that, instead of 5 people with 20 people, instead of 20 people with 100, community, regional, right? And so that's kind of my role as the steward of the pattern of WildSeed, right? As someone who looks at history and looks at how we're interacting and kind of identifies the core patterns and thinks about what we could do as an ecosystem, as an ecology, to disrupt those patterns and shift them to a more liberatory place.
Thank you so much for that additional intro, Aaron. And I also felt in my body kind of somatically when you were talking about the rules of the world and them being fundamentally broken and how that can bring up these feelings of rage and anger and everything. And I think you're, channeling it in some really beautiful ways. So I got introduced to you, obviously, through our Next Economy MBA, and would love to talk a little bit more about WildSeed. I know that you mentioned, that there are just kind of some premises or systems in our world that aren't working, whether we decide to acknowledge them or not. I'm wondering if you can maybe go into some of the premises that you're challenging to work with at WildSeed and maybe some of those experiments that you all are working with right now.
Yeah. There's a thing where I always like to start, because I think that I come from a particular lineage of thinking and organizing that comes from specific moments in the past decade that I think we kind of forget, but I think it's so important to continuously weave them into our narrative. And so I think of WildSeed's work now as like stemming from and being fundamentally shifted by 3 uprisings that our members were a part of, and I think are part of or influenced by. And I think for me, a lot of this goes back to Ferguson. And if you think about, there's a lot of really good writing that folks from Missouri have done about that, the concept of any herd USA, right? That Ferguson was a lightning rod because the structural setup of the city, like its finances were literally financed through fines against Black people, and the additional cost of being Black in that city fueled a economy for that local town that is reminiscent of many towns around the country, right? And like there are all these material ways that I think go beyond bigotry or like gerrymandering, where sort of race, class, and gender show up, and where basic things like funding a library require a basic racist relationship between the cops and a local community. And so Ferguson was very informative to me and really ended any last bit of me like working completely with inside the system. I think like it highlighted an aspect of the system, and it was like, if there's any work of harm reduction that can happen, that's not going to be my ministry. Like that's not what I'm going to be doing. And later, being a part of Standing Rock was probably one of the most transformative experiences in my life for a lot of reasons that, we could do a whole podcast on why I think Standing Rock was incredible and shouldn't be forgotten. But one of the things that was so crystallizing for me there, as after organizing a lot of years, like in my community around my own things and kind of being the one setting community agreements and talking with outsiders about how you had to show up, experiencing that from the other end was really transformative. And there was a moment where I went there with a group of Buddhists who were called to do spiritual support work at Standing Rock. So not doing actions, but just supporting people. And I had learned that there was a caravan that was feeding a lot of activists that needed some help. And I went and I just showed up at like 5:30. It was like the coldest morning of my life. And I'm just like washing dishes and preparing. And I kind of just like walked into somebody's like RV and just started doing dishes. Like they had signs, but like I didn't like sign up. I just started doing it. And I had this feeling that this is the most important thing I could be doing right now. And that in a just world, the way in which we do dishes and prepare food for each other would contribute to a larger project of healing the world. And that is a thread point that I think a lot of people who were participants and not organizers in Standing Rock felt. I think a lot of organizers, it was very stressful, a lot of police repression. They sprayed chemicals over the camp that, I can't even imagine what they've done to my lungs. But that kind of aspect of an uprising where we change the fundamental agreements of our social reproduction, of the way we reproduce our lives, led, I think, WildSeed to really think about what does infrastructures of care look like, and led to our kind of understanding of the WildSeed way, that we want to resource people in such a way that different capacities arise, because their brains and their whole somatic system is no longer using energy to navigate oppression, to keep themselves safe. And so our biggest, or maybe most sort of central experiment is in creating what a friend of mine, Mickey Kashtan, calls a community of shared risk and doing income sharing. So the WildSeed Society is a worker-directed nonprofit, and we have a kind of core team that all agrees to share income. Many of us had like side projects and consulting where we had income. And instead of paying people like a flat rate, which a lot of people do, or having some sort of like salary ladder, which a lot of people do, we have this pretty elongated process of figuring out what people's needs are and helping people understand their needs in a really expansive way, creating an understanding of the kind of world we want to live together and what is necessary economically to get us there, and then sharing everything that we bring in on the basis of need, on the basis of whose need is greatest, where can we make the best investments in each other's lives to get to that life of dignity and joy. And that experiment requires things that I was very shocked by. It requires a different kind of vulnerability. As somebody who kind of has always used my sort of intelligence and, I don't know how to say it, like, I was very good at school. Like, I was the kind of person that, like, I could figure out how to get an A. And I found that, like, being exceptional in that way was sort of protective, because our society doesn't treat Black people who are just normal, everyday Black people, if we can't prove that we're exceptional. The pain and the vulnerability of like not being exceptional as a Black kid growing up in Colorado was like very real for me. And the work of actually building a community of shared risk requires you to not be exceptional and to just be like, no, I got rent and I got these basic things and I have these like basic fears that I can't, talk my way out of, or like I can't put up a front or do some brilliant work to be like, I am terrified of being homeless again. Like, I experience housing insecurity and it terrifies me, and there's no, let's do a great pitch at this business that can like fill in that can like substitute for that economic vulnerability. And it requires me stepping out of being individually great and individually exceptional and being like, I'm going to work hard so that this person doesn't have to live with their biggest fear, and I'm going to trust that this person's going to work hard so I don't have to live with my biggest fear. And so a lot of the work wasn't like, structure helped. Spreadsheets always make things easier for me, but it was just deep personal work from people who had spent 15 years doing personal work and working on trauma and going to therapy and organizing and deconstructing our identities. And then there was this whole other thing about money. And so I think that experiment has shifted and changed the other ones. And the last uprising and last experiment that I think is really crucial to our work is the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor uprisings, because I was fortunate enough to be invited into Louisville during the Breonna Taylor uprising. And one of the things that I still kind of can't believe we don't talk about more is that there were many factors that went into Breonna Taylor's killing, but one of them was the police department being hired by development companies to evict people out of buildings so that they could then buy those buildings and flip them. And that there was a move of a kind of venture capital that had mostly been in coastal cities coming to these lower resourced sort of middle America where they didn't have the financial or nonprofit or community structures to push back to try and find another way to get sort of extra profit, super profit off of people who are marginalized in many different ways, so you could extract more and more rent than you could from people who had more options, and that the police were very explicitly agents of this kind of public-private partnership, like a local, very corrupt scale. And the Black community of Louisville was very aware of this, both in a like local people had done stories about it, but also just in the way that like if you live in a place a long time, you get very familiar with the boot that's on your neck. And we saw a protest movement basically push a local government into retreat, in which the local government was just like understood and was seen by everybody as unable to match the crisis that was happening. And we saw, particularly like with the bail fund, their radical decision to bail out everybody disrupted the carceral state in Louisville to such an extent that like the financial backers behind the prison system got worried, to the extent that Mitch McConnell started pushing from Washington bills to make sure that you couldn't have a bail fund that worked that way, that bail funds couldn't bail everybody out. And we're going to go into a whole long conversation about that. But basically, there are ways that different corporations make money off of the bail system and people being in prison because they don't have enough money to bail out. And if you bail everybody out, all of the vendors for that jail just aren't getting paid because there are no bodies in that jail, and a local economy can break down. And so I saw these just like amazing young people disrupting the system in this way and working themselves to such a break that if you had a conversation with them, you could feel that the repression had broken their spirit and broken their ability to regulate. And it's not that they weren't, it's hard to explain because they were remarkably competent people, but who couldn't function for themselves. They could function for the community. They could start a venture that fed 1,000 people in a week, but they like couldn't pay their own rent because the anxiety of signing something. And I realized that after years of organizing, I met people who were 10 years younger than me who had accomplished things that were amazing to me, but were so normal to them that like, if you mention it, they would just kind of look at you, wow, they're like, yeah, this is what we do here. And I was like, there's no me coming in as a consultant and helping them do that better. All we can do is take care of the like daily things that are really straightforward, like childcare, like cleaning the house, like cooking, that could free up their capacity to do only the things that they could do. And so that's kind of our second guiding experiment, which we kind of started to talk about as social reproductive defense. Everybody in our collective is very influenced by social reproductive feminism and Silvia Federici, as well as Black queer feminism and womanism, and this idea that caring for ourselves and how we organize that care is the fundamental question of any revolutionary act and any revolutionary campaign or organizing. And that the business model of sending in a OD consultant is just never going to work for movements. We need something that is much more intimate, much more sacred, and much more vulnerable to show up in a way that builds trust, in a way that is trustworthy, that is worthy of trust, to help kind of seed and nurture and develop a support system that allows people to resource themselves in a way that they can do work that only people in their position with those relationships can do. And that work is necessary and before any kind of granting or any kind of other institutional building. And so that program has developed into what we call revolutionary aftercare, and the ways that we care for people who are in crisis because of their movement work. And I think those two experiments of creating a community of shared risk and revolutionary aftercare are really at the heart of our work, and our economic kind of vision and the cooperatives and the network is all kind of about how do we fund that, because philanthropy doesn't understand it, and how do we create workplaces that people don't have to heal from? How do we create soft places of land where people can pursue their purpose in ways that actually resource them? And so those like 3 uprisings and 3 experiments are like kind of how I think about our work.
So much of what you talk about to me brings up this notion of collective liberation, which we talk about in our MBA program and at Lift Economy. And I have a part A and a part B to this question. But first, let's talk about, what does collective liberation look like, feel like to you personally and at WildSeed Society?
That's a great question. I'm a big fan of the Zapatista quote from Sub-Commander Marcos. We have to build a world that can contain multiple worlds. And so for me, collective liberation is where it is a fundamentally collective endeavor in which we support each other in being fully powerful. And it's not necessarily a utopia. I think there'll always be things to improve, and we'll always be human and have flaws, but it's a world in which we collaborate with other people based on a logic of liberation, right? A logic of love, collaboration, where consent is radical co-creation. And so what I think about is it's a world in which when I want to do something, I'm engaging with another person from a place of integrity, from a place of vulnerability, of like, this is who I am, this is what I want, and this is what I'd like to ask you to help me get. And the other person has the support and trust to answer authentically and be like, I hear that, this is what I want, this is what I can support you. And where there's divergence, the community supports people in saying, what is the world we have to build where both of these dreams and visions are possible? What's the world we have to build together where all of our needs are met? And to me, collective liberation is the state in which that's the norm. And that's how our family relationships are done. That's how our social relationships are done. And that's how we navigate things on the international sphere, right? It is a world that covers the whole world, in which we are no longer trying to create a rules-based order to fit other people's needs into, but rather meeting as organized polities, as groups of people with other organized polities and groups of people, talking about what is the world we need to build together that allows both of our worlds to coexist. And that collective liberation doesn't require and should never lead towards all of us operating under one model, even if it's something that I would love, like, I don't know, some solar punk gay space communism, right? Like, that's one world that I'm very committed to, but it's never going to be everybody's world. And I think collective liberation is really this multifaceted way of thinking and building together that allows all of us to do it. And I think that there's this, like, we talk about collective liberation as this like decolonization process or this like total love everywhere process. And I think where they come together is in my belief in abolition, and this belief that, take something like Afro-pessimism, right? This idea that Black people are so ontologically, our position in every society in the world is related to our position as a slave, and that, social alienation, social death, all of these things that tie to our position, you can't build a set of policies, even something like reparations, that makes Black people equal, because it's an ontological thing. The only thing we can do is make a new world. And to me, collective liberation is about how we make that new world, and that a world in which care is universal and not gendered is the world that can dissolve all of those like colonizing dichotomies. And so I think of collective liberation is both all that warm and fuzzy stuff and also an orientation to abolishing systems of oppression and understanding in a clear-eyed manner that we are all human beings and we all deserve love and kindness, but we are also all in this system that is murderous and extractive and devastating, and some of us benefit in ways that others don't. And that collective liberation is the process of walking with both of those things in mind, still committed to building a shared world together.
Yeah, I think as you were talking, I feel like there is just this like observation, and obviously the work that you do is inherently spiritual, and like it is like a lot of the deep work that individuals of WildSeed had to do to come together to even consider an experiment like this. I feel when you said like shifting from having these rules, I think I'm just curious how we move from this idea of rules or needing to build new rules or rigid structures to this idea of responsiveness and meeting the moment. And I don't know if you can speak to that more as an individual level or as a collective, like how you're able to create some kinds of structure, ways of organizing that still can be responsive to the needs of like the folks in it and also what's happening outside.
Yeah. It's really hard. I think that there is, our friends at Change Elemental talk about this. I think it was Alexis Pauline Gumbs who talks about needing to have a foot on land and a foot on water, right? That there is a world we live in that is a world of rules that are often broken, but often enforced. And then there's this world of water that is this like based on needs, futuristic, how do we get dignity and joy for everybody? And I think the work and kind of beauty and struggle of WildSeed has been, how do you create a shared worldview where we can understand people's needs in their own context and not in ours or not in the mainstream world's kind of context? And then how do we resource each other enough to be in a space of like openness and non-attachment to how we do that? And then how do you create a kind of a praxis of meeting needs that gets results and that people can do in the real world? And so a less abstract way of saying that is it requires us all sitting with what rules do we have that are the reasonable outcome of like rules of thumb you need to survive the world as it is. What rules have we had that is personal and self-protective? What rule is a kind of crystallization of trauma? And what resources do you need to kind of live in the uncertainty of it? So I love creating rules. Rules help me stay safe. And I'm very bad at doing a thing that other people kind of do really naturally. It's just kind of like muddle through social uncertainty well. And so I like things to be written down. And my comrade Erica is the opposite. She's a social butterfly. She like understands those things, and rules are all constraints. And so we have to have this conversation where her and Sandra has this like metaphor that she talks about. And this came up in our like personal romantic relationship too, that she's just like, you always want to close doors. That's what she says to me. And I'm like, yeah, we built a house together, so you should close the door of the house. That seems normal. And she's like, it's suffocating and I need windows open. And I was like, why do you need so many escape routes for this relationship to feel safe in it? I feel like you open a door, you're going to get bugs or you're going to get a bird coming like, and so in that, right, like I have learned a particular skill set to navigate the world and like understand the rules and navigate in like a risk averse way to like make sure I could move forward. And they have figured out, I think particularly as femmes, the way that life is always trying to put you in a box, and that like stepping out of rules is the way that they have freedom. And so we have to have this conversation about, okay, I need this door closed because there are certain things I can't function if I'm worried about. So like, I need an agreement that like, if we decide that this doesn't work, you're going to tell me a certain number of months ahead of time so I can make a plan, because housing insecurity is the thing that I just can't function with. And to do that work, you have to kind of separate the idea of a rule or a right, which is like if you break this, you deserve to be punished, which I think is like the heart of a rule, and shift towards this is a shared agreement that we're all going to uphold, that we're not going to pretend is objectively good or smart or useful, but it's contextually what we need to work together. And I think that's the biggest shift in being like, this agreement, which might sound like a rule, if you break it, I'm not going to say that I can now punish you, but it is going to be an opportunity for accountability and an opportunity for renegotiating and an opportunity for me to say, oh, you've broken a personal boundary and now I want to reshift things. And so when you can make that shift, you can then create the agreements that keep people safe, which for me is like structure, and which for Erica and Sandra is like a total lack of structure. And be like, what kind of structure can you accept? Mostly they're fine with rules around things they're never going to do, which is like, fine, if you're never going to do it and we both agree you're never going to do it, then that's a wall for me. And that's like that's a room you're never going to go into. And it's going to serve different purposes for us. But that kind of back and forth of being honest about what is our need. You know, for Erica, it's like my kids' education, my kids' safety is number one. And so Erica is going to get a lot more money because my need is never to face housing insecurity. And that I only need $2,000 a month between my partner and I to like keep that. Right? So like once I have that, like everything else is like, I can figure out everything else. And so we kind of construct these shared agreements based on that understanding. Yeah. I don't know if that made sense. But.
It was such a beautiful and like thematically grounded way to think about creating structure. As someone, and like all of us, I think, have been harmed by rules and structures that we didn't consent to even like putting our input into, and the ways that we've carried some of that punishment can also, or like the ways that we've needed that structure and it's helped us survive, can be really tricky. So I love this idea of just kind of starting from the ground up, like you said, that really vulnerable and like beautiful openness about what we need to function, and yeah, the shared agreements from there. Thank you. Aaron, did you have your part too?
Oh, well, I could talk for hours with you, Aaron Goggans, and maybe I'll ask both of these questions and you pick your path. So on the one hand, I'm really tempted to have you unpack the WildSeed narratives that Jeanette and I have both been fortunate to read, but maybe our podcast listeners haven't. There's narratives around your vision and your theory of change, and I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about that. On the other hand, we've been talking a lot about creating psychological safety in our movement spaces and creating places where people can heal from trauma. And very tactically, I have a personal question. I've observed that when we create that type of psychological safety, it gives people the safety to go deeper into more unhealed trauma and more personal growth. And as movements, how do we resource that? Like when people get permission to do the healing and then more healing is required because all of a sudden it's safe to be broken and need support and need that healing. So take those two where you will.
Yeah, no, those are just two great questions. I'm going to attempt to answer the second by answering the first. So one of the kind of grounding theories or like ways of understanding the world that really help shape WildSeed's strategy is this understanding that we kind of take from Grace and James Lee Boggs, that the central contradiction of the United States and increasingly of like Western society in general is that we are overdeveloped materially and underdeveloped socially, culturally, and emotionally. And then we would add spiritually. And for us, I know spirituality is like a hard subject for a lot of people. And for us, spirituality is about the things we hold as sacred. And what is sacred is those things that, for whatever reason, remind us of our connectedness to a greater whole. And that for some people, like my partner, Sandra, their spirituality does have Korean deities and an unseen world that we have to nurture a relationship with. And for someone like me, it is kind of a belief in what some people call like the suchness or vastness, that like life, if you really contemplate it, is beautiful. And there's all these just like kind of mind-blowing and heartwarming connections that we have. And whether it's like meditating or getting yourself into some kind of frenzy because you're like dancing, like I'm a big fan of social dancing, like anything where everybody in a room's like doing the same thing to a beat, like is an opportunity, is a sacred act that can remind us of this like beautiful connection. And the way in which we see the world from that point of connection gives us a whole host of strategies to meet our needs that is not possible, that is not logical, reasonable, or understandable from a more material strategic place, right? And throughout the history of the development of the US, whenever we have a problem, we have invested in the logic of the material and of accumulation. And so we have social unrest in the colonies, and we decide to basically invade and steal land from indigenous people so that the kind of immigrants who don't have a way to get ahead have this like safety valve by just allowing them to be homesteaders and subsidizing this, what some people call empire as a way of life, this way that we live beyond our means. And at every point, whether it's, you can think of even women's rights, right? That there was the first kind of initial waves of feminism were asking for a fundamental like rearranging of how we live life and the role of women and what it means to be human. And we kind of answered that with like the girl boss era, right? That like allow women to have bank accounts, make them all go to work. And like, that's the solution. It's like a material solution that we're all now living with. Like that didn't work. Like the Western expansion didn't work. The idea of solving racial inequality through a great society that was about affirmative action and giving people access to material extraction at higher rates of return didn't solve racism. The girl boss feminism didn't solve patriarchy, right? But that's what we do. Every time we have a crisis, we invest in it. And that this habit of ours constantly means that we can build more stuff, but we don't grow in a way to like determine what should we build, how should we build it, and how should we distribute the things that we build, which are the fundamental questions that we're facing as a society. And this strategy of empire, of living beyond our means by extracting from other people and solving every social problem with seeing who we can better extract from, creates these like three other crises. It creates the crisis of belonging, the crisis of unacknowledged history, and the crisis of social reproduction. And so this, I think, allows us to understand many things about our society. Like if you look at like movements and why when you create a safe space, more conflict arises. And I think it has to do with this, the way that the crisis of belonging, the crisis of unacknowledged history, and the crisis of social reproduction kind of feed off of each other. And with the crisis of belonging, we have this idea that the fundamental human impulse, one of the fundamental human impulses is connection. And we have this deep desire to connect with each other, but that desire to connect with each other is always commingled with this fear of the other, and this fear that the other person will deny our bid for connection. And that fear can be so somatically real that we create all these masks to lessen the vulnerability and then increase our kind of argument that we deserve that connection and recognition. And to me, that's where the idea of rules and rights come. Like, I'm very much against the idea of rights. I think it's a terrible Western conception. The right is basically like, you have to give me this recognition. And if you don't, you're a bad person. It's a threat of punishment for not following the rules, which is just another mask that keeps us from actually getting the kind of human connection that we want, which always entails somebody having a good and reasonable reason to say, I can't make that connection right now. And whatever we do to try and soften that blow, that's not resourcing ourselves or dealing with our trauma, is always going to create a problem. And with the crisis of unacknowledged history, right, like in their podcast How to Survive the End of the World. Autumn Brown says this thing that is mind-blowing to me, talking about how one of the reasons we can overreact or underreact to all these stories of abuse and extraction is because we refuse to acknowledge the history of genocide and rape and slavery in this country. We refuse to recognize the pervasiveness of harassment and sexual assault against children and against women of all ages. And because we refuse to acknowledge it, and I think particularly we refuse to acknowledge the systemic role it plays in perpetuating everyday life, when a small instance of it happens, we can do one of two things. We can deny it because we can't separate this little thing from the bigger thing, and we feel like we don't have the capacity to deal with the bigger thing, so we're going to ignore the little thing. Or we blow the little thing up because the pain and the violence that comes from talking about genocide, that comes from talking about slavery, that comes from talking about the systemic violence against women and how that's the underlying act of capitalism, right? The naturalization of women's work. The violence that happens when you talk about those things is so big that we can't talk about that. So I'm going to talk about this little thing and I'm going to blow it out of proportion so I can release all of my emotions about my personal life, about the history of violence on this little thing. And that, I think, is why in movement spaces, we have this desire to, instead of saying, because of the crisis of belonging, instead of saying, what you did hurt my feelings, and I just, as a person, don't want to feel that way, and I want to be in a trusting relationship with you, so could you stop? We say, instead of, you alienated this rule, you broke this rule, or you're denying my right, and you're a bad person. And my worthiness, my power doesn't matter because you should do the right thing, right? It's that distance to protect ourselves. We use that whenever there's little harms in our activist community because we exist in this larger structure that denies the history of pain. And our economy forces us to make widgets for other people and to do labor for other people. And a lot of our emotional and spiritual strength goes towards not kirking out at work, not just yelling at our manager, not just saying fuck this, I'm not coming in today. So much of our energy goes into being a compliant worker and following these arbitrary rules of capitalism and logic and ignoring that we're being stolen from by the organization we dedicate our lives to, that we don't have the capacity to react to these harms in any different way. And so for me, this understanding of the central crisis of Western civilization and the central contradiction and its three parts gives us a guide to be how do we make movements not be so volatile? And the answer is not to have people ignore microaggressions. It's not to have marginalized people not talk about their oppression. It's not to say that trans people need to suck it up or women need to get tougher or people of color need to get over it. It's to understand that we have to acknowledge the deeper history and we have to create regular space for that. And we have to resource each other to have the capacity to the actual nervous system regulation to be able to place the thing that's happening in the moment. And we have to build a culture of belonging in which we don't use political correct rules or a rights-based punishment. If you do this, you're a bad person, way to soften the blow of our bids for connection. We have to say that it's okay to change just because somebody wants you to. You don't have to be wrong in order to change. You don't have to have done something that is objectively against our shared ethics. If it hurt a comrade's feelings, if it triggered them in any way, your apology doesn't have to acknowledge this oh, what I did was racist or whatever. It had it had an impact. I care about you. I want you to change. It can also, the other side is also true. I care about you. I want to be connected with you. I think that your past trauma is changing the way you're experiencing me. And part of our relationship has to be discussing that too, right? That is the real work. And until we can look at our social movement spaces and address the crisis of social reproduction, address the fact that most of our organizing spaces, the person doing the most work is either economically privileged or so underemployed that they just have a lot of time. And both of those things generally come with a lot of trauma that has to be worked through, that is probably motivating their work. We have to connect that with regularly acknowledging the pain in some way that's beyond a performative land acknowledgement. Like some way that somatically, that is a ritual that allows people to release and isn't a ceremony. Like I think of a land acknowledgement as a ceremony where you feel better because you said it, and then nobody's allowed to question that, right? It has an ending. You read the thing, you have a moment of silence, everybody feels better. Malidoma Pachysame talks about that as ceremony. It has a predictable ending. But a ritual brings up spontaneity. It creates a space where people can be like, thank you for acknowledging that, and fuck that. I'm so angry. And it allows people to have an authentic reaction. And you have the real space to hold that, but you hold it in a container. And it says, okay, the first hour of this meeting is going to be acknowledging this, because we saw last week when we gave it 10 minutes, it changed the entire dynamic and we didn't release it enough. And it's using those three things in concert, I think, is a guide for how we build movement spaces that feel better, how we build businesses that don't cause harm and aren't extractive, and I think how we create a governance system that's not based on rights and laws and rules and punishment, but is actually about how do we build shared worlds together. And so that kind of analysis of society is really at the heart of how WildSeed views and navigates the world.
Aaron Goggans, what a gift you've given to our podcast listeners just in the past few breaths of what you've shared. And I also want to thank you for your participation in the MBA, because I recall you bringing this incredible lived wisdom that you were just talking about to conflict that came up in that cohort. So thank you. You're not only eloquently talking about what needs to be done, but you're living it and practicing it. And I'm so grateful for your leadership in this space. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to be able to contribute, and I learned so much from you all. And yeah, I've appreciated all of the time and energy you've gone into helping WildSeed think through the financial, real nitty-gritty aspect of how do we make this dream we have a reality, and how do we fund it and how do we organize it. And just really grateful to be in partnership with you all.
Well, Jeanette and we could keep this conversation going. Maybe we need to do a part 2.
I'm down. I got more time if you have more things to talk about.
Yeah, I frankly would love a part 2. I think that's something that's coming up for me, especially in just sharing how these things play out in organizations and friend groups and communities. I really am feeling that. I'm feeling this unacknowledged history. And all these little moments of pressure cookers. And we're here, we're at the beginning of December, and I feel like a lot of folks are just feeling really lost. I can see, some movements forward with a lot of uncertainty and not wanting to replicate harm. I see folks drawing back and maybe feeling, that they've broken a rule in a movement space and are unsure how to step back in. And we've got this layer of this very political economic system that we were talking about. I personally would love a part 2, but I'm wondering if there's anything that, you just feel you can share in the moment for folks who are carrying this and not sure how to go to their friend group, their organizing meeting, their workplace, and start to help facilitate some of these shifts in the way that we think about this stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's no one right way to do it. I often think it's not what we do, it's how we do it and why. That I think there's this thing about interaction that people can feel what our intentions are, and our intentions will determine what we do next. So I can say, how was your day? As a formal way of just let's start the meeting. But I really want to talk about the agenda. Or I can say, how is your day? As I'm going to build a culture of actually really caring about what's going on in your life. And if your intent is to build that culture, when you say fine, my follow-up would be but how are you really doing? What's really going on? And I think that if we want a movement that cares about our feelings, we have to be vulnerable to name it. And we have to do this shift where we don't assert our feelings under a moralistic premise. Where I don't say, as a Black man, the way you said that thing is like colonization and X, Y, and Z. It's not that those things are wrong. We really do in our interpersonal lives replay strategies of colonization and extraction. That is a real thing that happens. But most people can't do anything about that in an interpersonal way. We don't have the skills, the experience to do it. And I don't think it's necessary for us to. I think it's what many people can do and everybody should be able to do is hear, man, that really hurt my feelings. I'm feeling some kind of way. And in order to continue to have this conversation, I need to have trust that you have a basic level of respect for me. And that includes a respect of the communities that I step into the room with. And what you said made me feel like maybe that's not the case. And so I would love, if you want to continue this conversation, to have some reassurance about that. And the ability to talk with our comments about that opens up a lot of different responses on the other person. And it speaks to what we're feeling and what we actually want, so that we don't have to have conversations about our different worldviews, because our worldviews are just unique. And the thing that allows us to build a shared one is trust and belonging and synchronicity. It's not reading the same books and arguing about it. That's not actually how we create worlds. We create worlds through feeling and through feelings that build up over time. And so I think that's the first thing. I think if you're in any space, the thing that will always make that work more powerful is to do it with more people. And so the more you can organize in your space, if you want to do it at work, organize a union. Organize a heart-face solidarity union. It doesn't have to always come with a contract. Sometimes it can be breakfast before. And if you don't like how your manager talked to you, it can be bringing all of your work friends together to have a meeting with the manager together. That is the heart of what a union is. And it doesn't always have to be oppositional. It doesn't have to be a threat of if you fuck with us, we're not going to work. Though I do love a good strike, and I think it is very powerful. It can also be just even if I'm the only one feeling this, I need you to know as my manager that the rest of the staff also wants to work in a place where nobody feels this, even if they disagree with me. And that, I think, is how we actually can organize differently. If you want a place to feel better, open up with your feelings, invite other people to work with you on doing that, and organize people to be a block with you of open-hearted, vulnerable, feeling people in whatever space you're in.
Thank you so much for all of these wisdom drops throughout the course of the past hour. What support does WildSeed Society need right now? How can listeners support your work, stay involved, stay connected with you? Yeah, let's shower y'all with love.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. Unfortunately, late stage capitalism, I need money. WildSeed struggles to be funded. It's not a thing that philanthropy understands. Philanthropy is not a thing we like very much. We're also very bad at certain parts of capitalist business, very bad at charging for things. It doesn't make any of us feel good. And so your donations are very welcome. And you can go to wildseedsociety.com and you can click on resources and you can donate. We also have a virtual village, which folks can join. We fundamentally believe the only way through this is together. And so we have this capitalism adjustment quiz you can take just to get a real sense of kind of where you are in the structure of capital and what is a reasonable amount to donate every month. And so from $10 to $100 a month, you can be part of this community. And nobody's turned away. If you can't afford $10 a month, let us know. And there's ways to come in at $1. And we have regular groundings that people can come to. And so even if giving a lot of money isn't helpful, if you have $12 a year, you can join this and your participation is very valuable. We have a mutual aid group. Showing up and supporting other people in our community is also very valuable. We write a lot of stuff. We have blog posts, and if donating or joining a community isn't like where you're at, please go to our website, read our blog, share it. And the last thing is we have a bunch of like really big visions for how we create, cooperative banks, shared services cooperatives, wellness cooperatives. And we have this like really exciting plan that I would love for people to read and comment on. And maybe we can put a link to some of those documents. And if you just want to read, ask the questions and help us like really drill down on a community vision for how to implement that, that would be invaluable.
Incredible. Well, we'll definitely make sure those links get dropped in the show notes. And yeah, thank you again. We're so grateful to be in cahoots and collaboration with you. And yeah, your thoughtful, strategic approach has deeply inspired me and the work that we do at Lyft.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lyft Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.